what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast, hosted by me, Brandon Davis. On today's episode, I'm going to be hosting Adam Feuerstein. Adam and I have been able to have the chance to record over on his show where I can talk a little bit more about my life story. If you're new to the Get Over Yourself podcast and you're not used to me rambling on and on about myself, maybe go check out Adam's show so you can hear a little bit about my entrepreneurial journey. But in today's episode, that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on with Adam. His story throughout his entrepreneurial journey and what he's working on now to empower men. And before we jump into the full force of everything, I'm going to tell you a little bit more in depth. Here's Adam's bio for you. Adam is a seasoned entrepreneur with over 2 decades of experience in commercial construction. After successfully building and selling his construction company in 2021, Adam embarked on a new journey focused on personal growth and empowerment. Today, Adam is the founder and CEO of The Forge, a men's organization dedicated to helping individuals uncover their purpose, embrace authenticity, and cultivate freedom in their lives. Through workshops, live events, and community support, The Forge guides men on a transformative journey towards personal masculine sovereignty. With a passion for empowering others to live fulfilling and authentic lives, Adam is committed to creating spaces where men can explore their innermost selves and unlock their true potential. Guys, this episode is going to be incredibly impactful for all the men and women listening out there. The majority of the listeners on the Get Over Yourself podcast are men, though. So if anything that Adam says today resonates with any of you, consider checking out his program. It's quite amazing, and you will love it. But before we jump into the full conversation of today, I want to thank our sponsor, Utilize. Utilize is the app to make you rent anything locally. If you want to go out this summer, go paddleboarding at the lake, play pickleball with your friends, or go on a bike ride, you can rent all of those items that you do not have on Utilize. Check out from your local neighbors, local schools, and anything else that is renting equipment during this summer. And I promise you, it's going to make you have a more enjoyable time with those activities. So once again, go check out Utilize and their app. I will have a description in the link episode below. So guys, with all that being said, let's jump into today's episode. So Adam, as we kind of mentioned here in the bio, you got a very fancy bio. I always like reading the bios because that's the picturesque version of all the guests I have on the show. I want to get in the nitty gritty though. Tell us a little bit more about your construction company. What went wrong and what went right? You've told me before we even started recording some of the crazy mishaps you had and some life stories you could share in that. So
yeah, it was interesting. Well, I'm glad to be here, Brandon. Thank you. This is my first time ever actually being a guest on a show, and I'm honored that we get to do this together. So I appreciate that. No, I had a construction company when I was young, early 20s, started my first company, mid 20s, I guess, and ran 5 years, went completely bankrupt, lost everything, personal, business, all that stuff, kind of regrouped over the years, and had another chance where some friends of mine that I worked with at the first place started a telecommunications company. They decided to launch an electrical commercial construction company, about $5.5 million worth of contracts and a few $1 million in cash on day one. They handed it over to another guy to run, and 18 months later, it was in complete and total failure. So they asked me to come take a look at it. I had a couple of weeks to kill, so I did, and we were going to lose about $60,000, $70,000 a week for, I think originally we said 6 months. I think it took 14, where we were just at a loss to those figures all the way through until we got things turned around and kind of started putting it back together. And then we got up to zero. They, for my efforts, willing to let me start buying chunks of it when it was worth very little money, although the company was on the rise. And just really had a chance to work with some amazing people and especially my partnership. They were just really, really incredible stand-up guys. We did the entire thing on a handshake, never had one single piece of legally binding paperwork between us. And just went on this really crazy ride. I mean, millions of dollars lost and millions of dollars won, and the entire gamut in between, cutting our teeth, learning what worked and what didn't work in the middle, in the throes of all these huge contracts. And so it was just a wild, wild ride. And the blessing in all of it was just to get to know the camaraderie, like in our partnership, but also in our executive staff. And it gave me a lot of exposure throughout my entire time in the electrical trade to the younger guys coming up in the apprenticeship programs. And I realized how those men had changed over the 20 some odd years that I was doing that. And so, and what we had to do to adapt, one of the things that we did very, very uniquely was we worked with about 126 community partners every single month, like outreach. Our job and our mission was to do two things. We wanted to serve the underserved and give them an opportunity to come into the number one apprenticeship program in the state of Colorado, where they had an opportunity not just to make minimum wage, but to make a very decent wage in 4 years as they went through our program. So that was near and dear to my heart, and it proved to be a huge value to our success and our ability to turn around. Um, and when we sold it, that infrastructure added a lot to the value of the business because it was extremely unique. I still have never heard of another company, not to that size, that had that kind of interest.
Mm.
And we just had a really incredible and amazing group of people. Some of those people work there. Some of those people have gone off and started new companies. Some of them have fallen very, very deeply into their need for service to other people. And ultimately we're able to walk away in a very profitable situation and very beneficial to me and my family. And ultimately it laid the groundwork for my ability to do this work.
That's awesome. A lot to unpack there. A lot to unpack. So I want to first jump back. You mentioned kind of at the get-go of your story when you were in your early 20s that you started your first business and it completely failed. Not only did the business fail, but you lost almost everything in the process as well in
Mhm.
your personal life. So all the listeners here on the Get Over Yourself podcast, or I should say most, not all, they're 18 to 30-year-olds who are trying to do exactly that. They're trying to start a business, hopefully not have it go bankrupt,
Yeah.
but they're trying to start something, make a name for themselves, and hopefully provide a career or a business that can provide other people's careers
Yeah.
and help their families grow. What piece of advice could you offer them? Tell us, first of all, dive into that story a little bit more. What went wrong in that first business that ended up failing? And what piece of
Yeah.
advice could you give to everyone listening today to maybe avoid some of those same mistakes?
You know, we had these really wonderful intentions and they were very naive, typical of in our age. Frankly, we were going to be different than everybody else. It was going to be this great place to work and all this like really, really kind of fundamental camaraderie and which were wonderful intentions, but they were too weighted. I put too much weight on those things and not enough weight on really understanding how the business needed to operate from a financial standpoint. And in that industry, you have to be very careful because to yield a 4% profit is nearly unheard of. It's that tight of margin out of millions of dollars spent on every project. So if you think about that, like controlling your costs and understanding the impact is literally like a laser focused
Mm.
science and doesn't leave a lot of room for error, which is one of the reasons why that industry is so brutal. I mean, 1% is considered reasonable industry standard. When we
Wow.
sold our company, we were closer to 5.5%. And that was just completely unheard of in the industry, in which one of the reasons it had such value. So in that first business, I was unaware and naive that I didn't know that. And I was pretty arrogant, frankly. I just thought it was amazing. I'm running this company. We have employees. It wasn't very big, nothing like the next company, but it was significant to me. And I didn't realize that I had put us in danger with some of the negotiations we had gone on and doing some hotel work. We were building hotels, wiring hotels. Hotels are a particular thing to electrical contractors. They're difficult. On the business side, I didn't really understand the real gravity of the risk that we were taking. I had a great group of guys who were super loyal to each other. We had an awesome time. We all worked all the time.
Mm.
Really, 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 really committed, loyal group of people. I would discover that at my next company too, and that I had a talent for building those kind of teams and leading them. But again, what I should have done and the way I failed those people is by not considering the details, right? Like we get into these companies, especially when we're young, and not everybody does it this way. And we're very idealistic, and it's hard sometimes without having experience to really understand the significance of details, and especially when you're talking a company that has those kinds of margins, right? There's millions and millions of dollars in transactions going on all the time, but when you really, really break it down, what you're really fighting for is a very small fraction of that. So what I could have done differently and what I would do to redo that again is I would make a huge priority out of being humble and really pursue through my own humility the truth in the details. Because what I wanted to do is create a company that would serve the people that work there, and ultimately focusing on that too much without really getting into the nuts and bolts of the business part of it. And I mean, way down to the details. I mean, dollars matter when you're on those kind of margins, like dollar here, dollar there. Ultimately ended up putting myself, and I put myself in a situation where I failed the people I really wanted to serve the most. And
Mm.
that sucked. But honestly, what came of that, it was really strange. Like I was on the verge of suicide. And when that company collapsed, I had panic attacks for months. I couldn't sleep. I drank like a fish. I mean, I really ran my life into the ground because I was never somebody who wanted to blame. I never felt like a victim. I started that company. I was the owner of it. And when it collapsed, I was the sole reason for that. And I wanted to really take that responsibility. But in doing so, I'll tell you a quick story. At the bankruptcy hearing, I walk in to the federal building here in downtown Denver, and a federal marshal meets me at the door with my attorney. My attorney is shaking, like visibly shaking. And he says, Adam, there's something happening this morning we've never seen. And I said, what's that? He said, we've never actually seen this many people show up to a bankruptcy hearing ever, and they're here for you. And I'm like, really? And he said, we feel like you're in danger. And so we're going to have you escorted into the room and have an officer next to you during your hearing. I'm like,
Can I pause you right there real
yeah,
quick? Are these people waiting there? Are they former employees that weren't paid because of the bankruptcy, or who
nope.
was there?
Well, that's the irony in the story. So they shuffle me in there, right? As soon as I come around the corner, the room erupts with cheers. These are people that did work for me. They were vendors, they were clients, and they were friends, and they were there to support me through that process because
Wow.
they understood what really happened there. So it was kind of funny. And my lawyer's like, they just assumed, right, because it's a bankruptcy, that those people were angry. And they weren't angry at all. In fact, we afterwards on the steps of the federal building, we all kind of got together. There was too many of us to even go to a restaurant. Like I wanted to take everybody to lunch, but there wasn't a restaurant that could even put that many people in it. So it was very, very interesting. And later, what I would realize is, had I not gone through that very situation and had that experience, and really God imprint that knowledge deeply in my brain and in my being, then when years later, those same people that were there on that day would call to me and say, look, there's nobody else we trust to look at this situation. It's a threat to our larger company and our family's future. You're the only guy we trust. I knew what to do. And I
Hmm.
didn't know like immediately, but I knew because of their confidence in my integrity, regardless of the fact of what I had been through, and their support, and the things that I learned that had gone wrong in the first company, right? I call it the Berenstein effect. I don't, you may be too young, but the Berenstein Bears were stories my parents read to me all the time. And
Hey, I read those too. Those were good books. The
the
shows were
idea,
even better. The shows were even better.
yeah, right. Like the idea there is the dad's always teaching you what not to do, right? He's always trying to do the right thing. And when he fails, his son learns what not to do. And that's an equally valuable lesson. So when I got my second chance, number one, I did not take it for granted. And number two, I was able to prioritize the things I needed to pay attention to, the things I needed to really, truly monitor. And that led to making much, much better decisions in the second round. And I couldn't have done that had the first one not gone the way that it did.
So, two questions based on that. First being, you obviously mentioned you were suicidal at the time. This just failed. You felt like a failure inside of your own life towards other people. You felt
Yep.
like you're losing your purpose. You let everyone down.
Mm-hmm.
Talk us through that a little bit about, talk about your mindset, what was going through your head, what kept you going. Then, secondly, the story's actually amazing. You had not told me that before we started hitting record on today's episode. So, everyone listening, I heard that for the first time as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you cultivate such an environment of loyal friends and colleagues and employees where they show up to court? Here they are saying, hey, I know you couldn't pay me because we went bankrupt. I don't have a job now, but we're still in this with you.
Ironically, and I know what I said earlier about humility, but a lot of those connections I had with those people, I think came from humility. And what I mean is, and I'm a very firm believer in, David Hawkins wrote this in his book, Truth versus Falsehood. I'm a deep believer that humility is the pathway to truth, and that truth is the pathway to love. And I can go on about this for days. I won't take up that kind of time, but humility is a predecessor to discovering truth, certainly in human connection, I believe, because it's humility that allows us to show ourselves first, right? And what that does is put us in a position of leadership, not being dominating, but leadership, meaning that when we show ourselves first, when we produce humility first, the way that's leadership is it allows the other person to come into that space and feel like they can do the same thing. And when they realize that they can share their truth in their behavior, in their decisions, and most importantly, in a company, a corporate environment, they can immediately discuss their mistakes. All of a sudden, there's two human beings in a room working together, not this structure that comes with so many corporations. And what happens is you still have that structure. In fact, I would argue that my last company had probably more corporate structure than any other company I was even aware of, including our previous parent company. But it worked because that structure gave them purpose. It gave them leadership, and it gave them an understanding of the expectation for them, while simultaneously being able to do that with absolute integrity because of the humility we distilled in that culture. And that's tough. And it's really tough as a young person too, because you don't know. And so you sometimes have a lot of insecurities. And so being humble is a very easy thing to discard. But if you can pursue that and you can lead from that perspective, what ends up happening, because I know a lot of people who run companies, and a lot of executives to this day, they spend half their time just trying to find the truth because their employees are afraid. They can't be honest. They can't be authentic. And so when something goes wrong, 80% of the energy and time spent trying to diagnose the problem is just cutting through the things that aren't true that people are producing because they're trying to protect themselves. And that doesn't make them selfish. It doesn't make them wrong. And I think a humble leader looks at that and says, if I've got to spend 80% of my time in a given problem just pursuing truth, I invite that executive to look in the mirror and ask what he's doing to commit and create that environment, because he is the leader. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. He is the leader and he is the responsible party. And I think that's a huge step in creating that kind of an environment, is looking in the mirror and saying, I need an environment where the key people in my circle can walk in my office and say, you know what? I got out of bed yesterday. I came to work. I made this choice, and this is the result. And that result is bad. I never once in my life have ever punished somebody for that kind of a response and that kind of ownership, because immediately I know that problem is defined, which means 30 seconds into that conversation, we're on to the solution and we're moving forward. And I respect that person because they're being honest.
I think honesty is a very hard policy that people are not used to these days.
Yes.
Everyone beats around the bush. Everyone feels like they should have an excuse. And if they don't have an excuse, then that's the worst case ever. And
Yep.
frankly, I feel like if people could take exactly what you just said, not only would things be streamlined and way more efficient, but I feel like as a society, we could come together a little bit more. But obviously, the caveat to all of that is you had to be humble enough to take whatever honest feedback they're giving you, be it good or bad,
Sure.
and sit there and say, okay, I understand what you're saying. I might not agree with you, or in some cases, you probably did agree with them and recognize, yeah, what
Mhm.
you're saying is truthful, but still just be sitting there and being able to take it. Because our human nature, for the most part, everyone just wants to fight back.
Yeah.
If somebody calls you out on something and they think you're wrong, you think they're wrong, you're going to want to fight back. And at the end of the day, that's not going to foster a good work environment.
Sure.
Employees aren't going to believe or trust in you. They're not going to be honest with you. There's always going to be excuse after excuse. But yeah, Adam, dive into more about that moment of suicidal thoughts when you're drinking a lot. Tell me a little bit more about that and some things that got you out of the trenches, if you had any spiritual experiences
Yep.
throughout it. And yeah.
No, really, one of the things riding on that first company, and this, I'll try to keep this simple as possible because it can get boring really fast. My brother is a kidney transplant patient. My brother actually has my father's kidney in him. He had a disease called interstitial nephritis from the time he was 7 till he was 11. And my father is the kind of man where, when we saw this, it's an infection, a degenerative disease of the kidney. So we saw for that 7 years that Daniel was going to need a transplant. And the second that time came, my father volunteered his body and risked his life so quickly that at that time, my brother was the first transplant recipient in history to never have ever been on dialysis a single time in his life. So
Well,
that's my boots to fill. Now, how that relates to that first company is the laws in Colorado at that time were very important. And they said that basically at that time, it's changed since then, that if you had a pre-existing condition like my brother requiring tens of thousands of dollars a month and any rejection pills, even though he'd had the transplant and long since been healed, then you were uninsurable. The only way to get around that law was you could work for a company that had a group insurance policy. So at that time, my brother's kidney transplant was I was concerned. My father did not put this on me, but I was concerned that threatened my dad's ability to retire because then he would have to write these huge checks every month to keep my brother alive with his anti-rejection drugs. So one of the huge responsibilities that I absolutely put on myself was to create a company so that Daniel, my brother, whether he worked there or not, I could provide healthcare for him and secure my father's retirement. And my mom too; she also worked the entire time, so both of their retirements were at stake. And I did that for several years. That company lasted a little over 5 years, and I was successful. I built enough of a company, we had enough members, and I was able to pay for and get our group insurance going so that my brother Daniel was covered. So that was a huge part of that, right? Like I wasn't afraid to be broke, I wasn't even that big a deal. And they're repoing my cars and turning our power off. I mean, even that I could survive. I mean, I'm a craftsman, a master at my craft. If I threw my tool belt on, I could go out and make money. And that's exactly what happened. Once I got through all that. But dealing with that is that idea that not only did I let down the people at my company, but my brother, and my parents were always like, it's Adam, we'll figure this out. It's no big deal. They never put that on me, but I'm the firstborn. And I've always been called to step up for those kind of responsibilities. And I felt like that was a huge part of my purpose. And I had literally violated my purpose. Like I'd let myself down and in turn let them down, my brother, my father, my mother. And that was extremely difficult to get over. It was probably months before I could even look at either my dad or my mom or my brother and not just completely fall apart, like literally sob uncontrollably like a child. It was super, super difficult. I got into health and fitness at the time. I love riding bikes, did a lot of that in my life. So I did a little bit, got back into mountain biking for a while, and I really just had to take one step at a time. I did not believe in God at that time at all, not before, during, or even for a long time after. I didn't commit to a spiritual life actually until about 6 or 7 years ago. So not only did I put all that pressure on myself, but I refused to hang that or even allow God to help me or have any kind of assistance or guiding at all. So it was very, very self-destructive. So coming through it was just being miserable to the point where time took its toll and I could start to rebuild myself and put it back together and take another shot.
Hmm. What a powerful story. I can just picture your dad. That is like the most idealistic dad who's willing to give up everything, potentially sacrifice his own life for the safety of your brother, his son at the time.
Yeah, I mean,
And
his
a lot
attitude
of
is like,
stress.
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a lot of stress that built up upon you in that time. I feel like that's completely reasonable. As I'm sitting here hearing your story and I was kind of putting myself in your shoes, I'm thinking, wow, I would have probably acted the same as well. And thank goodness there's just these means that God has given us here on this earth where we're able to kind of combat some of the things that
Yeah.
were going on inside of our head. You found fitness and exercise and mountain biking. And as crazy as that might sound, that's kind of what pulled you out of the trenches at that time. And
Yep.
so it's just a blessing to see that even if you weren't a believer in God at the time, that He was still able to help you out through some of the things that He gave us here on this earth. As weird as that might sound.
No, it's not weird at all. In fact, I remember having that thought when I started to consider the idea that maybe I was completely wrong in my beliefs and that maybe there was something, a higher power there, that God was really there and that there was a plan. And one of the things in my life is like reflecting on that, years later, 12, 13 years later, and saying, taking a different perspective, like let's stop right now and look at the position I'm in now. And what are the chain of events that got me here? And initially you're like, well, my work ethic, I work like crazy. There's no limit to the things I'm willing to do when we're invested in a company or a project or working with others. Okay, yeah, well, that counts for something maybe. But then you get to this like larger picture and you're like, wait a minute. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how smart you think you are. There are things that are out of your control that are in God's control. And the beauty in that really recognition of how the universe works is the relief that you find instantly when you realize that it's okay that God's in control.
If you could step back and always give God the reins, life would be so much more manageable. He's always directing us. The
Yeah.
beautiful thing about life is He gave us agency to choose what we want to do. The
Yep.
most difficult thing about life is He gave us agency and lets us choose what we want to do. So
Yep.
beautifully put there, Adam. As we're coming up on the close of today's episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast, however, I do want to talk a little bit about the Forge, this group that you're kind of dedicating the next few years of your life towards. Tell us more about it, why you started it, and how anyone could hear more information about it.
No, thank you. No, we sold the company. My wife also had a national accounting and finance firm. She saw after we got done with our transaction, she sold her company, and we kind of cruised around. And by cruised around, I mean we kind of started in Honolulu and ended up in East Africa, and just had some really, really interesting experiences. And the entire time, really just going through huge spiritual transformation, understanding that we were just on a path and that we were here to follow the path. We don't need to control it, and waiting for the voice of God to give us direction. And that direction is working with men, loud and clear. There's few things I've ever been so confident in my entire life, but this one is literally from God's mouth to my ears, and this is my calling and this is my purpose. And again, only in ways that he could devise. My entire life has spoke to this end with working with all the men, and we did work with some women, but the bottom line is 98% of all employees in commercial construction are men, so that's just a majority there. That's not to exclude anybody, that's just a fact of the industry. And I did see those changes, and I've always worked close with communities and nonprofits and disadvantaged people and corrections and all that kind of stuff. So when I got freedom to really just kind of walk the earth and see what I could see and learn what I could learn and let God guide both me and my wife and our 6 children and our blended family, there was just no doubt that this is where we came. So what we do is we deal with, my wife's the co-founder. We have a woman co-founder of the Forge. Basically, at the end of the day, we create a community for men to come together to find purpose, realize their own authenticity, and discover freedom.
That's awesome. And one last question I have for you there. This is a question that I've had for myself for many years. You see a few of these men's group popping up. There's one actually local to where I'm at down here in Provo that is quite large. I have many friends who are part of it. That's very anti-stereotypical of a guy to join a group like this where you talk about your feelings, you're more open. What would you have to say to those people who might be questioning something like that? For all the guys listening right now, what are you telling them? Why would they want to join?
Well, first of all, I completely understand. Absolutely, being skeptical. The Forge is different because feelings are absolutely a part of it. But understanding that the pillars of our masculinity are to provide, protect, and lead is the end that we're working towards. Everybody marches in that direction. Are there feelings involved in that? 100%. And we are there to be as authentic as humanly possible. But understand what that means. What that means is we get around each other and we support each other in ways that only men can do to each other, right? That means call you out if we think there's something isn't right. But it also means having your back in a way that only a brotherhood can really provide. And so it goes so much further than just the emotional component, although that's foundational to it. Once that's exposed and the men know that when they come here, this is about pure integrity, the things that come behind that are so powerful and so powerfully masculine that you leave with a completely different impression than your anticipation was when you showed up. And that's 100% of the time to everybody who's ever walked through a door at a live event, on a Zoom call. We're doing like this ruck this weekend. We have these physical things up in the mountains. Every single time, that's the one key feedback that is absolutely universal in every experience.
That's perfect. Thank you, Adam, for that. Thank you for sharing your story, for being open and honest with everyone listening to today. Once again, everybody, if you want to hear more from Adam, you could go check out his podcast. My episode that I just recorded with him on his show will be out on May 27th. So make sure to go give that a listen. If you want to hear anything else from Adam on his podcast, he'll have links to all of his websites, social medias, and whatnot, so you can possibly join the Forge as well. Guys, with that all being said, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.